The Little Ones was the DLC for This War of Mine that introduced kids. It also introduced a selection of new characters who were related to those kids. Welcome back to A Survivor's Guide to This War of Mine. Today we will be covering Christo. I know that you can only select him with his daughter Iskra, but I will be covering the kids in their own later episodes, so do stay tuned for that. Christo's trait is Determined Father, and while this may not seem like much, it is very useful as it reduces the time he needs to sleep and makes him the best guard in the game on par with Roman. That is very different to his combat rank of D, which is one of the lowest. His other abilities is a homey personality, meaning that he likes his fellow survivors doing well, and a medium running speed with 12 inventory slots. He also has no addictions and doesn't drink and has no guitar skill. It is worth mentioning here too that his closeness with his daughter allows them to both sleep in the same bed, saving bed space if you need it. The downside to this closeness though is Iskra's mood will massively impact his, more so than with the other survivors, and therefore he will get more depressed if she becomes unwell. So that's the mechanical side of Christo. Let's move on to the lore. This will be complemented by Iskra's story when we get to that video, but for now we'll just stick with his. So let's start with his recruitment speech. If he comes to the door, then move on to his two stories before looking at his possible endings. Firstly, his recruitment speech. Hello, my name is Christo, and this is my daughter Iskra. We have been living in the basement of our house for the last couple of months, but the soldiers forced us to leave. You look like decent people, so I'll ask you straight. Can we stay with you? Iskra is too young, but I'll work to earn it. As a teenager, I used to help my parents a lot in chopping wood to heat our house, so that can be my duty here as well. What do you say? It is worth noting that while he mentions chopping wood, there is no evidence to say that he is any better than any other character at chopping wood. We'll now move on to his stories. Let's start with the good story. Many people in our area moved to their basements as a precaution. We all felt much safer there, even though the life conditions were not the best. I heard stories of people burned alive in their basements, but I didn't tell them to Iskra. I didn't want her to be afraid. When a shell hit our house, burying our neighbours in their basement, everybody rushed to help. We managed to pull out our neighbour and her son, but her husband had been crushed. Iskra did not see him, but since that day, she's been having nightmares of being buried beneath the rubble. Despite my daughter's fears, I decided that staying in the basement was safer than not. I thought of it as a temporary arrangement. I didn't expect the siege to last very long, but it turned out we spent many months there. Everyone from our tenement shared whatever they had and helped each other. One day, the soldiers came and told us to get out. They gave everyone a minute or two to evacuate, and then they threw in grenades. People they suspected of helping the rebels were shot on sight. They let us go because Iskra had no one else but me. And now we can look at his traumatized story. The shellings forced many people from our town to cover in their basements. The walls would shake, the plaster would fall off the ceiling. We would huddle down in fear, Iskra in tears. Everyone thought of the possibility of getting buried alive. One day, our tenement was hit by a shell. We survived, but our neighbours were less fortunate. Their basement collapsed, burying them underneath tons of rubble. We managed to pull out our neighbour and her son, but her husband was crushed. Iskra saw his mangled body and has been having horrible nightmares ever since. After that fateful day, we no longer felt any safer staying in the basement, but we had nowhere else to go regardless. Our days became bleak as our supplies dwindled, and every day could be our last. It seemed like the siege would last forever, and I was starting to lose hope of ever seeing my wife again. All of this ended, however, when one day soldiers came to the house. They were sweeping the city for rebels and their supporters, throwing grenades into random basements. We weren't there when it happened, but most of our neighbours were killed. We didn't go down there to grab our things. We left, never to come back. So it seems that Christo and Iskra have been through a lot, and if they make it to the end of the war, then Christo can get the following endings. If Christo dies in the war, you get Christo died during the siege of Pogorin, leaving Iskra with only her mother and her grandmother. She would always miss him. If Christo kills himself in the war, completely broken, Christo chose to take his own life. How did it come to pass? If Christo decides to leave the shelter, desperate, Christo left the shelter one night, never to come back. If you reject both Christo and Iskra, you get that Christo and his daughter had to look for some other place to stay. Hopefully, they got lucky and survived the war. We will probably never know. And now we have Christo's endings. If he gets to the end of the war but with poor karma. Despite his family's reunion after the ceasefire, Christo could not forget the horrors of war that changed him. His wife tried to help him, but he pushed her away, and they slowly grew apart. They stayed together for Iskra's sake, but their marriage was nothing but an empty shell of what it had once been. If he makes it to the end of the war, but is sad or depressed from the situation. Christo's family reunion was a bittersweet one. Though they were all alive, Christo's experiences changed him, making him quiet and withdrawn. Even when peace settled in, he rarely participated in social meetings, preferring to spend time alone and, if possible, outdoors. And finally, if you managed to get to the end of the war with him in good spirits and him having not had any bad karma. When the war ended, Christo managed to reunite with his wife. Luckily, she was unhurt. They resumed work and did their best to alleviate the effect war had had on Iskra, as well as ensure she had a normal childhood. Perhaps, with a lot of love and care, they would succeed. And so there we have it, Christo, the Determined Father. I hope you have found this helpful, and if you did, please do consider dropping a like. I will see you back here next week for Henrik's tutorial. Ta-ra!